The story of Atom Air Flight 574 is a story about promises. It's about the promise of a new era in Indonesian travel, the promise of a safe journey, and well, the promises that were ultimately, tragically broken. Atom Air was a low-cost carrier, born in the boom of budget aviation that swept across Asia in the early 2000s. It promised affordable flights to millions of Indonesians. The airline's bright orange livery was a symbol of optimism. It was new, it was modern, it was supposed to be the future. But behind the vibrant branding, a darker picture was emerging. Reports of safety concerns, maintenance shortcuts, and a culture that prioritized profits over procedure were beginning to surface among pilots and industry insiders. The aircraft for Flight 574 was a Boeing 737-400, a workhorse of the skies, registered as PKKKW. It was not a new plane. It had served with 8 other airlines before it was acquired by Atom Air. This in itself is not unusual. Planes often have long service lives. However, this particular aircraft had a history. On New Year's Day 2007, a crew was tasked with flying this very plane. In the captain's seat was 47-year-old Referee Agustian Widodo. He was an experienced pilot, with more than 11,000 flight hours to his name, a veteran. Beside him sat 36-year-old First Officer Yoga Susanto. He was less experienced but was considered a competent co-pilot. Together they were responsible for the 96 passengers and 4 other crew members on board. They walked into the cockpit that day, unaware that they were about to face a challenge that would overwhelm their training and expose the deep-seated flaws within the airline they worked for. The passengers of Atom Air 574 were a snapshot of Indonesia. They were families returning from holiday visits, business people heading to meetings, individuals starting a new chapter in a new year. On board were 96 souls, each with a story, a destination, and a life outside the metal tube they now occupied. 3 of them were American citizens, a family on a trip. The rest were Indonesians from all walks of life. The mood in the cabin was likely one of quiet anticipation. The flight plan was straightforward. Flight 574 took off from Wanda International Airport in Surabaya at 12:59 p.m. local time. The planned route would take them across the Java Sea and then over the Makassar Strait, a large body of water separating Borneo and Sulawesi. The destination, Manado, was a popular tourist spot known for its diving and natural beauty. The initial phase of the flight was completely normal. The aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The seatbelt signs were switched off. Passengers settled in for the journey, perhaps reading a book, listening to music, or simply gazing out the window at the world below. From the cockpit, the view would have been one of endless blue sky and scattered clouds. First Officer Susanto was the pilot flying, while Captain Widodo was the pilot monitoring, a standard division of duties. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to plan. As Flight 574 continued on its path across the Makassar Strait, the weather ahead began to deteriorate. This was not entirely unexpected. The region is known for its tropical climate, and powerful, localized storms can develop quickly. On their weather radar, the pilots could see a large storm system directly in their flight path. To avoid the worst of the turbulence and potential danger, they made a decision to alter their course. They requested permission from air traffic control to deviate to the east, a standard procedure to fly around the storm instead of through it. This was sound airmanship, the kind of decision pilots make every day around the world. The deviation, however, put them on a new heading and took them away from their pre-programmed flight path. This is where the first seeds of trouble were sown. While navigating around the weather, the pilots needed to rely heavily on their instruments to know their exact position and to eventually rejoin their original route. But this was the very aircraft that had a history of navigational problems. The inertial reference system, the plane's primary navigation tool, had been acting up for months. It was a known issue, a ticking time bomb waiting for the right set of circumstances to detonate, and those circumstances were now rapidly aligning. The captain's attempt to fix the navigation system became an obsession. He was deep into the maintenance menus of the flight management computer, a place pilots are not supposed to be during flight. He was trying to reset the IRS to force it to work correctly. This distraction was profound. He was no longer monitoring the aircraft's primary flight instruments, the very gauges that show altitude, speed, and whether the plane is flying level. He had developed tunnel vision, focusing on one problem to the exclusion of all others. While the captain was distracted, a critical event occurred. Without anyone noticing, the autopilot disengaged. The exact reason is unclear, but it may have been an unintentional input from the pilots as they wrestled with the controls in turbulence or a fault in the system itself. Suddenly, the first officer was flying the aircraft manually, without the aid of the autopilot, in poor weather, and without the full attention of his captain. The plane began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, bank to the right. It was a gradual roll, not a sudden lurch, making it difficult to detect without closely watching the attitude indicator, or artificial horizon. This is where the breakdown in communication became fatal. The first officer, struggling to control the plane, did not clearly state the problem. The captain, absorbed in his task, did not notice the increasing bank angle. The cockpit, which should have been a place of clear, concise communication, fell into a state of confusion. The aircraft's bank angle continued to increase, unchecked and unnoticed. It rolled past 45 degrees, then 60, and just kept going. At this point, the plane was no longer truly flying, it was, falling out of the sky in a tight spiral. The laws of aerodynamics were beginning to break down. The wings, now angled steeply towards the sea, were no longer generating enough lift to keep the 737 airborne. The nose dropped, and the aircraft began to plummet. The descent rate grew at an alarming speed, reaching thousands of feet per minute. The G-forces would have been immense, pinning everyone and everything to their seats. It was only at this moment, with the plane in a terrifying dive, that the pilots seemed to realize the gravity of their situation. The cockpit voice recorder captured their final panicked words. The captain shouted instructions, but it was too late. The aircraft was in an upset, an extreme attitude from which recovery is incredibly difficult, even for the most skilled pilots in a simulator. In the dark, disoriented, and under immense stress, their training failed them. Instead of correcting for the roll first, they pulled back on the controls, trying to lift the nose. This action only tightened the spiral, worsening the dive. Critically, the crew never made a distress call. They never transmitted a Mayday signal. Air traffic controllers were completely unaware of the drama unfolding in the cockpit. On their screens, Flight 574 simply disappeared. In the hours after Atom Air 574 vanished from radar, confusion reigned. At first, there was hope. Misinformation spread like wildfire. A local official mistakenly reported that the wreckage had been found in the mountains of Sulawesi, and that there were survivors. This false report was broadcast by news agencies around the world, giving desperate families a cruel and fleeting sense of relief. For a brief period, the world believed this was a story of survival. But as the hours dragged on, the truth became painfully clear. There was no wreckage in the mountains. The plane was missing, lost somewhere in the vast expanse of the sea. The search and rescue operation that followed was one of the largest in Indonesia's history. The Indonesian military deployed ships, aircraft, and thousands of personnel. They were joined by assets from other nations, including the United States and Singapore, all converging on the Makassar Strait. But the search area was immense, a massive stretch of deep, often treacherous water. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, with no clear indication of where to even begin. The searchers battled strong currents, high waves, and the sheer scale of the ocean, all while the clock was ticking. For the families of the passengers and crew, the waiting was an unbearable torture. The key to understanding what happened to Flight 574 lay on the ocean floor, nearly 2,000 meters below the surface. The aircraft's two black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, held the final secrets of the flight. These devices are designed to withstand incredible forces and are equipped with underwater locator beacons, or pingers, that emit a signal. However, these beacons have a limited battery life, typically around 30 days. The race was on to find them before they fell silent forever, taking the truth with them into the abyss. The search for the pingers was a high-tech effort. The U.S. Navy sent a specialized survey ship, the USNS Mary Sears, equipped with sensitive towed sonar arrays. For weeks, the ship methodically crisscrossed the search area, listening for the faint, rhythmic pulses from the deep. Finally, on January 21st, nearly 3 weeks after the crash, they got a hit. They had detected the signals from both black boxes, but finding them was only the first challenge. They were located in a deep, dark, and dangerous environment, far beyond the reach of human divers. Retrieving the recorders required another complex and expensive operation. It wasn't until August, more than 7 months after the crash, that an ROV finally descended to the seabed and carefully retrieved the two bright orange boxes. The recorders were flown to Washington, D.C. to be analyzed by experts at the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board. The final report from Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee, released in March 2008, was a damning indictment of both the pilots and the airline. The flight data and cockpit voice recorders painted a clear and chilling picture of the flight's final moments. The investigators concluded that the primary cause of the crash was a combination of pilot error and technical malfunctions. The chain of events began with the pilot's prolonged and obsessive attempt to troubleshoot the faulty inertial reference system, a problem that should never have been addressed in the air. The report detailed how the pilot's intense focus on the IRS led to a critical lapse in situational awareness. They failed to notice the autopilot had disengaged and did not monitor the aircraft's roll. The plane banked slowly to the right, exceeding 100 degrees, and entered a steep, corkscrewing dive. Beyond the actions of the pilots, the investigation uncovered a deeply flawed safety culture at Adam Air. The report noted that the airline had a history of safety incidents and that maintenance practices were dangerously inadequate. The very fault with the IRS on the accident aircraft had been reported by pilots 25 times in the preceding 3 months, yet no effective permanent repair was ever made. The airline, in its pursuit of low-cost operations, had normalized deviance. The findings sent a shockwave through the aviation world. It was a textbook case of how human factors, when combined with technical faults and a poor organizational culture, can lead to catastrophe. The aftermath of the Adam Air 574 disaster was swift and severe. The crash exposed the systemic weaknesses in Indonesia's aviation oversight to the world. In response to the damning investigation report, the European Union took the unprecedented step of banning all Indonesian airlines, including the national carrier Garuda Indonesia, from its airspace. It was a massive blow to the country's reputation and its aviation industry. The message was clear: Indonesia's safety standards were not being met, and until significant changes were made, its planes were not welcome in Europe. This international pressure forced Indonesia to act. The government launched a massive overhaul of its aviation sector. The Directorate General of Civil Aviation was reformed, safety regulations were tightened, and inspections became more rigorous and frequent. Adam Air itself did not survive the scandal. Just a few months after the final report was released, the airline had its air operator's certificate permanently revoked by the Indonesian government. It ceased operations, its orange-tailed planes a permanent reminder of a failed promise. The crash served as a brutal but necessary wake-up call. The legacy of Flight 574 extends beyond Indonesia. The crash became a critical case study for airlines and regulators worldwide on the importance of human factors, crew resource management, and the dangers of a poor safety culture. For the families of the 102 victims, the legacy is one of profound and unending loss. No safety reform or regulatory change can bring back their loved ones. Their fight for answers, and later for the recovery of the black boxes, ensured that the truth of what happened was not buried at the bottom of the sea. Their tragedy became a catalyst for change, forcing an industry and a nation to confront their failings. The memory of Adam Air Flight 574 is now woven into the fabric of modern aviation safety. It stands as a somber monument to those who were lost, and a perpetual warning that the price of safety is eternal vigilance.